The purpose of Freethought Forum is to be vigilant to the encroachment of religion into government and to educate the general public as to what a freethinker is.
My thoughts give me power.
No scholar can map them.
No hunter can trap them. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei.
I think as I please.
Hello, and welcome to Freethought Forum, a weekly program on this channel. My name is Harvey Kendall, and a little bit about me. I am a retired professor of German. I taught at California State University, Long Beach for 25 years, and retired in 1993 and came to Texas. And immediately upon arriving in Texas, I learned that there was a county bearing my name. So I looked into it and discovered that indeed I had ancestors who were among the early settlers in Texas. And that started me on a program of studying those settlers and learning about my family, and particularly about the German Freethinkers who settled in south central Texas in what we call hill country. And it has led to two programs. This is the second of those two programs. The first one has already been recorded and broadcast, and now we're doing the second of two programs based on the history of the hill country freethinkers in central Texas. In part one, I talked about the origin of those freethinkers and how around 1800 in Europe, in Germany particularly, there was great restlessness among particularly the poorer people and the intellectuals of the country, based on several factors. First of all, famine. North Central Europe has a record of many cases of famine sweeping over the area, and the greatest sufferers of them were always the poor people, of course. The poor people were also heavily taxed, and this was a great irritation to them and was the source of a movement among intellectuals to end that practice. There was this great discrepancy between the rich and the poor, the rich being the aristocracy, and the poor being primarily the peasants, the farmers. These poorer people and the intellectuals were also greatly disturbed about this alliance between the church and the aristocracy. The church took advantage of the situation. They knew where they stood. They knew that if they wanted to maintain influence, they were going to have to cater to the aristocracy. So they were constantly doing things for each other and ignoring the poor people. There was also, particularly in Germany, a great doubt of dogma. And you undoubtedly know that already in the 15th century with Martin Luther, there was an opposition to the dogmatic practices of the Roman Catholic Church, which was the only Christian church at the time. And through Luther, the concept of Protestantism, protesting, was originated. And in the late 18th, early 19th century, that idea again came to the forefront, particularly among the intellectuals, and they were raising objections simply to the dogmatic, dictatorial methods exercised by the clergy. Now, there were Germans who came to Texas as early as 1815. These were not always connected with this movement that we think of today as freethinkers, but they were nevertheless escaping from the oppression that they were experiencing in Europe. The main group of Germans came to Texas in 1844, from 1844 through 1847. These were primarily under the auspices of an organization in Germany called the Mainzer Adelsverein. This was started by a group of not peasants this time, not intellectuals, but aristocracy. There were a number of enlightened noblemen who agreed with this restlessness in the lower classes. They were located primarily in the little town of Bebrich. At least there was a conference that was held there among the noblemen. The Bebrich is on the North Rhine area. And they eventually elected a leader who was Prince Karl von Solms-Braunfels. Braunfels is a name that's familiar to you, I'm sure. And he became their leader and most influential advocate. There was also an important support for him at the University of Halle, which was quite a distance away. But that was the intellectual element there. This Adelsverein, the name means only simply that it's a union of aristocracy, nobility, but it had a subtitle. It was called the Society for the Protection of German Emigrants to Texas, specifically to Texas. And then in 1847, there was a secondary group that was sponsored by a group of 30 mostly professors or people who were associated with the University of Heidelberg. And among them was the poet Achim von Arnim and his wife Bettina, and you might recognize that name Bettina, which became the name of a little town here in the hill country in Texas. It was named after her. These peasants applied for immigration permission to Prince Karl von Solms von Braunfels, and those records, incidentally, are kept here in the library, I think it's called the Solms Library in New Braunfels. And you can go there and read in their actual handwriting their petitions for immigration. They, first of all, most of them landed in Galveston. It wasn't called Galveston then. I think it was called Indianola at the time. At the very beginning it was called Karlshafen, named after Prince Karl. Later changed to Indianola and then to Galveston. They proceeded from there to a place near LaGrange, which was a farm and a jumping off place that Prince Karl had established there. And from there they were apportioned property and homesteading rights in Friedrichsburg, Burney, New Braunfels, Sisterdale, and nearby communities. Then let's skip ahead a few years. In 1854, there was a young man named Ernst Altgeld who lived in Sisterdale, who got the idea that there really should be some more support for German immigrants, and he petitioned a wealthy New Orleans businessman to buy property or to gain property by application near Comfort and make these homesteads for newcomer German residents. The wealthy man from New Orleans appointed Ernst Altgeld as the surveyor, and he went to the area then around Comfort and laid out plots of land, and these were eventually dealed out then to German immigrants. By 1856, there were 130 German families living in Comfort. This was an intellectual adventure, but they had to have some support, some money, so they practiced primarily livestock farming and lumbering. They supplied the lumber for the construction of all of the early homes that were built in San Antonio. Their intellectual capacity also attracted many scientists. There was the Dr. Herff, H-E-R-F-F, whose name is still common in San Antonio. The botanist Lindheimer became very important in the world of botany, and if you look through indexes of plants and look at the ones that were identified in the early 19th century, Lindheimer's name is on about half of them. There was also the journalist Douay, who became important because of his, first of all, founding a newspaper that later became the Express News in San Antonio, And he was also important because he was a liaison between these Germans in this small settlement in Texas and the federal government in Germany. Their movement spread to other sites nearby, including to the town of Kendalia, which I'm happy to say was named after an ancestor of mine. Now, they lived rather happily in the community of Comfort, Sisterdale, in that area, until the Civil War began to appear on the horizon. Already in the 1840s, the southern states were talking about secession. And in the 1850s, Texas took up the subject. Our governor at that time was Sam Houston, and Sam Houston was vehemently opposed to secession. He was vehemently opposed to slavery also. And the German freethinkers supported him. Now, I've used that word freethinker. Let's go back a moment to identify what that means. In our introductory song, you heard, Die Gedanken sind frei. Our thoughts are free. This term came to be in use in Germany around 1845, primarily through the poet Eichendorff, who wrote that poem. And it was popular among this small clan of people, but not recognized worldwide. Their concept of free thinking meant that they were not going to take dogma and dictatorial practices from the clergy. They were thinking for themselves, thinking freely. This group now in the early Civil War years supported Sam Houston, opposed secession, and declared themselves loyal to the Union being the North. They were therefore harassed by the secessionists, who were by far the majority, particularly in East Texas. In East Texas, there were lots of cotton farmers, and they depended upon the slaves for their livelihood, and therefore they opposed the Union and supported the Confederation. The homes and farms of these freethinkers were often raided, their houses were burned, their people were murdered. There were 150 lynchings in a 3-year period in that area. By 1860, the Texans then were greatly divided. Now, there is some altruism in their intentions. They were opposed to slavery, they favored a strong union, and so forth. But it must also be pointed out that the freethinkers, these German settlers, were dependent on federal soldiers to protect them against the Indians. So they couldn't simply declare themselves enemy of the federal government and lose that protection. There were military units formed by the secessionists and by the loyalists. Primarily, the primary military unit was the Knights of the Golden Circle, which was cessationist, and it led eventually to a conflict in San Antonio in January of 1861, in which these secessionists, that is the Golden Circle, the Knights of the Golden Circle, won out, and they were therefore empowered and took their case then to the Texas legislature, which in February of 1861 voted to join the Confederation of Southern States. Sam Houston was forced out of office. And then the legislature of Texas required all citizens to sign an oath of loyalty to the Confederacy or get out. Now notice that's important too. The freethinkers refused to sign. They didn't immediately get out either. The harassment increased. The freethinkers then had to form their own military unit called the Union Loyal League. And in June of 1861, Governor Clark, who succeeded Sam Houston, proclaimed a prohibition of any Texan having contact with any U.S. citizen or U.S. sympathizer. Now notice what that did to the Freethinkers. They were essentially made non-citizens at that point. The Loyalty League grew and met secretly in San Antonio to discuss protection, but not much was done. That was in late summer of 1861. Therefore, many of the German settlers, these freethinkers, simply went into hiding, particularly the men. They went into the hills, in hill country, camped there, and left the farming and lumbering up to the women in the community, who were relatively unscathed by the harassers. Now let me pause a moment to identify us again. My name is Harvey Kendall, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Freethought Forum, a weekly program on this channel. Now let's proceed to further into the Civil War. In 1862, in April, the Confederate Congress, the southern states, instigated universal draft for all males 18 to 35. The Hill Country Germans, of course, refused. They also, again, refused to sign the Texas loyalty oath, and they were labeled traitors, threatened with death, and they had to protect themselves either by hiding or getting out. From February through May of 1862, there were several notable victories for the Union, the Northern troops. Shiloh, the Battle of New Orleans, and the Battle of Galveston, close by. Now, in July of 1862, a contingent of 64 hill country men banded together and decided to escape to Mexico and hoped there to proceed to the Gulf at Matamoros and cross over by boat to New Orleans and join the Union Army. In those 64 men, there were 62, incidentally, they were all very young. They were all under 35. 62 of them were Germans. There was one Anglo and one Hispanic man. Their captain was Fritz Tagener, which is a name that you may also see on street names and buildings and so forth in San Antonio. And then after they got underway, they were joined by another Anglo, John Sansom, who was their guide because he knew the area on further west of the hill country. Now I have a map over here that explains what they were doing. Let's look at the map a moment. This is Bexar County. San Antonio takes up most of the center part of that county. There's Blanco County, Kendall County, Gillespie, Bandera, Medina, Kerr, Real, Edwards, Uvalde, and over there is Kinney County, where this trek ends up. We have here the cities of San Antonio, here's Bernie, here's Comfort, where most of these people originated from. There's Kerrville. Now, just west of Kerrville is an area called Turtle Creek. That was the assembly point for these 64 Germans. They didn't all arrive there on the same day. They arrived between July the 25th, 1862, and August the 3rd. So about a week it took them to gather. Now, at the same time, up here in Camp Pedernales at Morris Ranch, there was a contingent of the Confederate Army. They soon learned about this gathering down here at Turtle Creek and took off in pursuit. However, the Germans from Comfort, assembling in Turtle Creek, didn't know about this until several days later when they had reached what is now Real County. So they were unaware that they were being pursued until they reached Bullhead Creek on August the 6th. Bullhead Creek is way over here. They proceeded on one day ahead of the Confederates until they reached this area down here on the Nueces River, and we really should call it the West Nueces River because it's the west prong of the Nueces River. The rest of the river flows north, so we speak of the north prong and the west prong. This battle on August the 9th of 1862 took place there on the west Nueces River. It was a vicious attack by the Confederates. About half of the Unionists were killed outright that one evening, and many of them had already been identified as leaders, and they had been singled out as leaders. Over the next 2 weeks, the Confederates continued to pursue the remaining ones until there were 36 of the original 64 who were slaughtered. There is a question as to whether this is a massacre or is it a battle, because these 64 men who took off were armed, but often the history books talk of it as a massacre. There were only 3 of that original bunch who actually made it into Mexico, onto Matamoros, and then on to New Orleans and joined the Union Army. There was considerable havoc as an aftermath. It included the arrest and persecution of that Loyal League, the Union Loyal League that had been formed back there in Comfort, and their leader, who was Edward Dagener, whose name is also prominent on street signs and buildings and so forth around. He had lost 2 sons in that battle. So when he was arrested, the Confederate jurists kind of took it easy on him, apparently, because he got off rather easy. He was fined $5,000 and was forced to sign a pledge of loyalty to the Confederate States. The viciousness against the Union Loyalists in Texas did not end with that. In fact, it grew. There were hundreds, several hundred lynchings that took place following this trial in San Antonio. Then eventually the Civil War concluded, and that's a subject for several other programs, I guess. Then in August of 1865, a delegation of mostly women from Comfort went to the battle site and gathered the bones of the slaughtered, brought them to Comfort, and buried them on a hillside above the Guadalupe River. It's just north of downtown Comfort today. And on August the 20th in 1865, they buried the bones there, and eventually a monument was erected, and the monument looks approximately like this today. It's a 4-sided obelisk, and on the 4 sides are listed the names of the men who were killed and were buried there. Now, the Freethinker movement in Hill Country suffered greatly, of course, from the oppression by the followers of the Confederacy. After the Civil War, they never regained an authoritative position that they once had. However, their influence is shown by the fact that the first church in Comfort was erected only in 1892, some 60 years after the first settlers began there. Freethinkers still exist, I assure you. I'm one of them. The towns of Comfort, Sisterdale, Burney, Bettina, and Candalia are very much colored by their presence, and there are Freethinker organizations throughout Texas and indeed throughout the United States. The strongest ones in Texas being in Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, and Houston. The San Antonio chapter in 1998 erected a monument, which they were not allowed to call a monument. They called it a cenotaph, since the Freethinkers there already had one monument. They called this one a cenotaph to the Freethinker settlers in Comfort and nearby. The townspeople of Comfort, however, raised objections, and the monument was subsequently stolen, and it now rests where it was dumped in a meadow northwest of town. In the summer of 2002, a second monument was erected on private property downtown and it still remains. You can see it there. Now, in the 2 or 3 minutes that we have left, let me just review briefly what I went over. This consternation in Germany in the early part of the 19th century, caused by famine, heavy taxation, the huge gap between the rich and the poor, the church being allied with the aristocracy, and the doubt of dogma, caused an intellectual movement that sprang into a recognition by a certain group of aristocracy who sponsored these immigrants coming to Texas. Incidentally, that organization actually sold stock in their organization, mostly to other aristocracy. Then in 1815, the largest, or there was already some settlement in Texas. The largest group came in 1844 through 1847. In 1854, Ernst Altgeld started a petition to lay out plots in the city, what is now the city of Comfort, and the German freethinkers were invited to come there and establish homesteads. Then by 1860, there were 30,000 German freethinkers settled in Hill Country. Now, Texas in the Civil War, by the 1850s, Governor Sam Houston, supported by the freethinkers, opposed secession. The freethinkers were harassed. 150 lynchings of men and boys took place. In the 1860s, the secessionist Knights of the Golden Circle was formed, which was a military unit whose sole goal was to eradicate the freethinkers. In 1861, this conflict between the secessionists and the loyalists under General Twiggs, you might know that the name here in San Antonio, and that conflict resulted in the secessionists being empowered, and they sort of took over the Texas legislature. Sam Houston was forced to resign, and the Texans were required to take an oath of loyalty. The freethinkers refused, and they formed their own military unit, the Union Loyal League. And in June, Governor Clark proclaimed that no Texas citizen could have contact with anyone supporting the Union. In 1862, then there was the draft, and the freethinkers refused to join the draft. And then came that group of 64 people who were determined that they were going to leave, which is what the governor's proclamation asked them to do. Nevertheless, they were pursued by the Confederates across northern part of Hill Country, and most of them were slaughtered at the Battle of the Nueces. Only 3 escaped to go on and join the Union Army in New Orleans. Okay, that just about winds up our little talk on the Texas Hill Country Freethinkers. Again, my name is Harvey Kendall, and I represent the Freethinkers Association of Central Texas, and this is their program called the Freethought Forum. Thank you.
I think as I please, and this gives me pleasure.
My conscience decrees, this right I must treasure.
My thoughts will not cater
To duke or dictator, no person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei, no person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei. me.